welcome to our first plenary engagement. And our task is going to be reflecting on the state as a catalyst for social entrepreneurship, for social innovation. And our panelists today are Monsieur Raj from Sentinel Global. He'll be telling us a little more about what he does when I frame the first question for them. But we know that he is involved in advisory services rendered to diplomats and technocrats regarding BRICS. We also have Monsieur Eric, who will tell us a little more about his role. But I know that he serves as the trade attaché of the Republic of Kenya to the DRC. We also have Monsieur Lukunga, who serves with the National Agency for Digitization. So I have been denied a mic by the technical people. What I'll do is to frame the question and then share my semi-stationary microphone with the panelists. Monsieur Raj, I would like to invite you to share with us about yourself and what you do for the development of peoples across the globe.
Thank you, sir. Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished guests, a very good morning to all of you. My name is Rajshekhar Ray. I am the founder of Sentinel Global. You may not find much on the internet about me, but I'll just share a bit of my background in terms of what I do. Our firm, primarily, we focus on the India-Africa corridor for economic and business development, which includes helping African countries attract foreign direct investment, primarily from Indian investors. We represent small, medium enterprises from India. We also represent fairly large state-owned enterprises from India. And we also are lucky to represent some billionaires, famous billionaires from India, but living around the world. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go to some of the details of kind of transactions we do, but I'll give you an example. I'm born in India, but I grew up in next door in Zambia, in the Copper Belt, when I came to that country when I was 4.5 years old. I started my schooling there. Then due to, in those days, it was very volatile and security was an issue. What happened was we became victims of very violent crime, and at that time, Zambia was having certain economic challenges. My father used to work for a very large British multinational, which was a joint venture between then the world's largest gases company and the government of Zambia. He used to represent the government of Zambia as an employee of the government of Zambia in the joint venture. And we really didn't want to leave the country. We loved it so much, but it was such that the crime was so severe. My father still has scars. He's alive. He's 81 now. He's got those scars. And we felt very sad in 1985 when we were leaving Zambia. So I went to boarding school, to an American international school in India. and completed my education. I'm an accountant by training. Worked in corporate India, but while working in corporate India in different industries, I was yearning to come back to Africa, yet I was not getting the right opportunities. And like they say, I was very lucky in the year 2004. Very rarely I would open the newspaper. We would get in the Times of India, there was a classified, and I had never applied. I got my first job when I was out of university, finished my articles in chartered accountancy. It was always somebody would pick up the phone, call up my father, what's Raj doing? Oh, he's just. Yeah. So I always used to get my employment. I worked in different industries. In 2004, I was scanning. I was just sitting at home. I was unemployed for about 6 months from transitioning from one job to the other. And then I see an ad saying, the ad was like this, very brief one. It said, very wealthy, non-resident Indian based in East Africa would like to hire an executive assistant. And what was the job requirement? Somebody willing to travel and has some exposure to Africa. This was 2004. And I looked at it and I said, probably I'm the one. And I'm going to share this anecdote with you. It could be also a motivational for a lot of the youth who could be here and in the country as well. We were called in for a walk-in interview in a 5-star hotel in a city called Mumbai, which is the commercial capital of India. And I go in there, in the lobby of the hotel. There were 45 other people waiting there. And it was walk-in. We were called at about 9 o'clock in the morning. I sat there. Nobody came to represent us because apparently the gentleman who'd flown down from East Africa, he was in one of the suites in the hotel. We were not offered any tea, coffee, nothing. So we were like thinking, is this the kind of employer we're going to be working for? It was about, probably out of the 45, it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. No lunch, nothing's been, we didn't know whether we had to go leave because what if we were called when you stepped out to go and have lunch? I just stood there, it was perseverance. I was called in at 4:45. Around only 10 people were around, they've interviewed. I walk in, I see the gentleman seated. He doesn't even stand up to greet me when I go to meet him. And I'm like, he's very disrespectful. But later I realized why he didn't stand up. The person was paralyzed, 50% of his body was paralyzed from head to toe. So one side of his body wouldn't function. Yeah. And long story short, I got the job. Our work was to help African governments with, there was a lot of blocked funds of the government of India. What it meant was there were exporters from India who would export to Africa, and the importers in Africa would transfer the local currency to their banks. Yet the countries at that point in the 70s, 80s, even up to 90s, a lot of countries had foreign exchange issues. So they couldn't remit, the central banks did not have enough foreign exchange to remit to Indian central bank. Our work was to try and enable recovery of that. We were very successful. That allowed us to empower industry. So a lot of people today in India don't know a lot of the trade that is going to several African countries. We opened the gateways for them because till the time we were not able to recover some of that debt, these Indian exporters would not get insurance cover from the government of India for their exports. So in that, it was just an enabler, and very similar to the strategy over here, what we're talking about in hearing the XNLC.
I'll ask another question.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you can go ahead.
So there we have Monsieur Raj, who has always been yearning to return to Africa because he had the opportunity to be raised for some bit of his life in Africa. So now, I'd like to invite Monsieur Eric from Kenya. Don't hesitate to share about yourself. You're a trade attaché, so storytelling is good sometimes. We are in Africa. So it's okay to tell the story. Karibu.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Translation, are you able to hear?
Thank you very much, Mr. Richard, for the great welcome to this event. My name is Eric Nabwana. I'm a trade attaché at the Kenya Embassy. I'm a trade expert by profession, having worked in the public sector for over 17 years. Around 2 years, 3 years, almost 3 years in DRC. I'm a great Pan-Africanist. I wish and I always look forward to see that Africa or countries within Africa are able to trade within themselves. My passion, even at the moment, is to see how do we do business between African countries, how do we improve or enhance exports from DRC to other African countries. It's a time that we need to change the narrative of Africa and making Africa be felt on the global stage. My passion, and from the invitation, is to share the experience from a public entity perspective or a public sector perspective or from a government sector and see how best we can work together to enhance trade. In brief, that's all about me. Thank you.
Bonjour à tous. Je vais d'abord me présenter. Je suis Jean-Luc Mougogwa. Je suis le coordonnateur adjoint en charge des questions techniques et de planification au sein de l'Agence pour le développement du numérique. Je représente le coordonnateur Dominique Miguicha, qui est empêché. Il accompagne le chef de l'État sur un voyage important. Alors, il s'agit bien de d'abord nous présenter, docteur, c'est ça? Une présentation de nous-mêmes.
Just talk about yourself. The story is important. In Africa, we tell stories. What brings you to the development space and how you would like to influence what is going on.
Absolument, et merci pour cette opportunité. Alors moi je suis, si je puis dire, de la génération des pillages. C'est-à-dire qu'en 91, quand il y a eu les pillages, mes parents se sont battus pour que nous puissions poursuivre notre scolarité à l'extérieur du pays. Et donc j'ai étudié en Belgique, à l'Université catholique de Louvain-la-Neuve, et j'ai eu un diplôme d'ingénieur informatique en 2005. Et j'ai travaillé pendant 10 ans en France et en Belgique, principalement dans le milieu des banques, dans l'informatique bancaire. Mais j'ai toujours eu ce souci de la RDC et de mon pays. Et en 2015, j'ai décidé de revenir ici à Kinshasa, avec l'ambition d'apporter ma pierre à la construction de cet édifice qui est une RDC performante. Et c'est comme ça que j'ai commencé à travailler dans le domaine privé, toujours dans le cadre de l'informatique bancaire. Et en août 2022, lors de la création de l'Agence pour le développement du numérique, qui est un service spécialisé de la présidence, le chef de l'État m'a fait l'honneur de pouvoir l'accompagner pour déployer sa vision pour le développement d'un numérique qu'il veut comme un levier de progrès social, de développement économique et de bonne gouvernance pour notre pays. C'est ainsi qu'il me nomma coordonnateur adjoint en charge des questions techniques au sein de l'Agence pour le développement du numérique. Et je pense pense que pendant les discussions, j'aurai l'occasion de vous expliquer plus en détail ce que l'agence fait pour le développement et le progrès social des Congolais et du pays.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you to our panelists. Now we have this idea of social entrepreneurship. And social entrepreneurship measures its success by impact on the peoples, by impact on the environment, above and beyond the financial bottom line or the economic benefit that the enterprise would deliver to the entrepreneur. So the broad question that I am framing to our panelists is, what social enterprises do you envision that would be necessary to propel a people-driven development? Okay? So we have a desire towards development that is people-driven. So what social enterprises would you envision that will propel people-driven development on the continent? Raj, the African by raising and by desire.
Thank you, Mr. Richard. It's a bit inconvenient, but what I would, the social enterprises that we would, and taking India as an example of how development has taken place, one of the areas would definitely be fintech, financial technologies, in empowering people in the rural places, because that's where majority of the people are living. Yes, there's a lot of urbanization taking place, but you know, for most of any kind of enterprise to operate, you would need financial resources that can be easily deployable, available for what we call banking for the unbanked. And I think Agrominda is doing a wonderful job. I had an opportunity to, meet with Mr. Piana in India, and thank you very much for inviting us for this event. It's the first of its kind that I'm attending in Africa, because most of the events we do are very simple, where it's, investment forum, people coming, and, we promote strategic partnerships between Indian enterprises and African enterprises that are looking for investment. So fintech would definitely be one of them. And then there will be different industries, like when we take healthcare, there are so many, innovations that are taking place, because this healthcare is, again, completely people-driven. You need people to look after people. So I can share with you, India will be the first country in the world to probably disassociate healthcare from wealth. It's like an analogy. We associate premium healthcare to people who can afford it. Very rich people, you can go travel, get the best of healthcare. What India is going to do is, just like in the telecommunication, the cell phone tower does not know, the reception is going to somebody who's got very limited economic means, or it's going to somebody very wealthy. So we have democratized telecommunication. Similarly with the broadcasting sector, when you watch a television channel, the rich and the poor get equal quality. Everything is the same. In healthcare, that's not there. India will be the first. It'll take about probably 10 years of doctors working on it, very famous doctor. So those are some of the things that we, or our firm, Sentinel, we try and promote. The learning curve, which has taken India maybe 20 years, but they have learned it. We could probably implement that in 2 or 3 years in Africa. So that's something that we could look at.
Okay. So fintech, healthcare. Eric, what do you think would be the most appropriate social enterprises that would propel a people-driven development?
Thank you. My thought on this is that we look at what we have as communities in Africa. We are not going to tell somebody in Lualaba, yes, let's get this technology, because in the long run, we might have challenges with technology access. But what we can do is to downscale all this that we have to a community level. Identify or associate a community, associate an administrative area with a product or with an initiative that you want to stand out with. And in this case, I'll give an example of what has been happening in Kenya. When you go to Kenya, you'll meet a lot of tourists buying the beads, the traditional beads from the Maasai community. So what happened over time, we realized that the Maasais as a community had traditional knowledge of beadwork. So the thing was this: work on the traditional knowledge by improving their handcraft ability. That means you already have a product that you are selling within a community. Transform that product with the knowledge you have into an economic activity that brings income. So for me, I will downscale it down to a social enterprise that is well aligned to economic activities of a community, that identifies with a community, that identifies with the administrative area of a place. This will enable that product to stand out when it gets to the market. So I've used the Maasai beadwork, the Ushanga beadwork, to reflect what we can also do in other African countries. It has worked for the Maasai. It may not work in DRC. So for DRC now, our people's driven is to look at the existing economic activity undertaken by the community. Build on that, improve on product development, and then coordinate that with market access. And therefore, we shall have a very vibrant sector. Thank you.
So in the sense that a social enterprise will be that which is contextualized, which is plugged within the people it is meant to grow. Thank you. Monsieur,
alors moi je vais vous décrire l'ambition et la vision du chef de l'État par rapport à l'entrepreneuriat social et qui est mise en œuvre par le gouvernement actuel. Nous savons que nous sommes un pays qui vivons de nos ressources naturelles, nos mines en particulier. Et comme l'avait dit le chef de l'État, nous devons changer de paradigme par rapport à la revanche du sol sur le sous-sol. Et donc l'important pour nous, c'est de voir toutes ces entreprises sociales pouvoir travailler pour la création de la richesse des Congolais. Nous voulons que la transformation et le gain, la valeur ajoutée, puisse se faire sur le territoire congolais. Et nous pensons que les entreprises sociales sont parfaitement adaptées dans les milieux ruraux pour aller déployer cette intelligence, cette énergie, pour créer des poches de richesse au niveau des milieux ruraux et développer le pays par la base. Et il y a notamment un important projet, le PDL 145 territoires, qui consiste à construire des infrastructures au niveau de tous ces territoires pour être les premiers enablers de ce développement qu'on veut par les entreprises sociales. Et au niveau du numérique, et l'Agence pour le développement du numérique en particulier, nous regardons et nous stimulons tous les projets qui permettent d'augmenter l'inclusion numérique à travers notamment la couverture en réseau de ces populations, parce que nous savons que le numérique a des externalités positives fortes. J'ai aimé l'exemple de notre entrepreneur qui nous a expliqué la capacité à recevoir des paiements de manière numérique, qui lui a permis de diminuer sa dépendance par rapport au crédit bancaire et d'avoir moins de besoin d'un fonds de roulement, et elle a pu être plus efficace et se développer. Et c'est ce genre de choses que le numérique peut apporter de manière transversale à toutes les entreprises sociales. Le DG nous a rappelé que nous sommes dans les modèles de forte exploitation tels que sont les mines, avec des grands investissements. Finalement, la richesse n'est pas suffisamment partagée. Et l'entreprise sociale, peu importe son secteur, nous voulons la promouvoir parce que c'est à ce niveau-là que la richesse est correctement créée et plus naturellement partagée au niveau des communautés.
Thank you very much. And you've just started us off onto the next question. Raj, I'd like to invite you to address your mind to government specifically. Okay, what should government do to enable these social enterprises that we have identified? Okay.
Good, very good question. I don't want to put myself in trouble by trying to advise governments. We do the advice in closed doors, but one of the things with government would be when we look at it like for foreign investors coming into a country that they've not engaged in before. One of the things that they would look at, yes, they would read up, they would see what are the opportunities, but would be what are the laws, what are the legislation in the country? Maybe when we're talking about, again, I go back to the example of fintech. What is the legislation? What's the central bank? How have the governments, eased capital coming in? I know most countries make it very easy for capital to come in, but repatriation becomes an issue. The government of India has come up with something with today, 40% of the world's daily digital transactions are done in India, globally. And this is numbers that are astounding. We had very low numbers. There's a government, there's a leadership that's been there for the last 10 years. They've done 2 terms. We are seeing the results because transformation will not happen overnight. It will take time. So the Indian government has got something called UPI. People can Google it. It's a unified payment interface where we can even do now cross-border transactions. We could have an Indian go to the Eiffel Tower in Paris and take this phone. There's a QR code. You just scan it. In 4 seconds, they would have paid to enter the Eiffel Tower in Indian rupees. So that's the kind of example that I can give you that we are doing. And India is engaging a lot of countries around the world, primarily in Africa. I do play a role in trying to promote and facilitate something along those lines. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And this goes to Eric, again in relation to what he said, the ability to communicate across borders with ease, okay, especially financially. Eric, we have a challenge here, and it's good that Jean-Luc is here and yourself. I call myself a Kenyan of Ugandan extraction because I've spent close to 20 years of my professional life in Kenya. So my domain of operation digitally is the Kenyan number, even though I am Ugandan. It is not possible, Eric, to wire money through M-Pesa directly to a Vodacom line. So along those same lines, help us talk about that question, and don't hesitate to ask Jean-Luc, because he's in charge of digitization, to explain further why that is not possible. Let's go ahead.
Thank you very much. Practical experience that we face when you're doing cross-border trade within African context. But I believe one thing that we are doing, even at the continental level, we are unifying the payment system for SCFTA. So it will make it very easier. So that unification, that means that somebody can pay in a country where he's located, pay for a product that can come from another country and do the transaction completely. Now, here is where now my good friend Jean-Luc comes in. How then can we then make sure that that product is visible to another consumer in another country within Africa? The issue of e-commerce at a small scale, cross-boundary. How then can I be able to request for a product, pay for that product, and it's delivered across the borders? So the issue is that government now becomes more of an enabler. It's just creating a right environment to have players coming in, state and unstate actors. The state actors, like my friend Jean-Luc, may consider having a legal or a framework, a policy framework to support that. Non-state actors now may come in, like the logistic people, to deliver that product. So for us, we look becoming more as an enabler to facilitate the transactionary business. But I believe my good friend here, Jean-Luc, may be able now to expound more on the digital aspect and how they can conveniently support such initiatives. Thank you.
Alors, merci beaucoup pour vos apports, pour vos apports respectifs. Et nous sommes toujours ouverts à collaborer, à entendre des avis, donc n'hésitez jamais à vous rapprocher des autorités congolaises pour qu'on puisse discuter ensemble de comment on peut faire pour que nous puissions atteindre nos objectifs. Concernant la problématique des paiements qui est un enjeu majeur pour le développement de l'entrepreneuriat social. Donc les pays ont différents niveaux de maturité et l'Inde a un niveau de maturité que nous connaissons à travers la technologie UPI et le Kenya est un modèle pour nous en termes de monnaie mobile. Et aujourd'hui, nous avons la monnaie mobile qui aide énormément les entrepreneurs au quotidien pour déplacer de l'argent d'un point A à un point B et faire des paiements. Et nous avons besoin d'aller plus loin. Et nous sommes en train d'aller plus loin. Il y a des initiatives aujourd'hui au niveau de la Banque centrale de pouvoir unifier tous ces moyens de paiement. Parce qu'un paiement est un paiement qui provient d'une banque ou bien d'une monnaie mobile. C'est la facilité avec laquelle on peut payer aux transactions le plus bas. Et donc nous voulons unifier tous les moyens de paiement à travers ce qu'on a appelé le switch monétique de la RDC, qui sera pour nous un premier point pour les paiements unifiés. Une fois que nos paiements intérieurs pourront être unifiés au sein d'une seule plateforme de paiement, c'est à ce moment-là que nous pourrons maintenant regarder dans quelle mesure on peut faciliter les paiements transfrontaliers avec les différentes communautés dont fait partie la RDC. Sur ce point, il ne faut pas oublier qu'il y a les réalités. C'est que nous subissons une agression d'un pays voisin. Et c'est un contexte qui ne facilite pas le développement de ce genre de collaboration et de technologie. Et donc là, le politique doit s'imposer pour que cette agression puisse cesser. Et ça nous permettra d'avancer et d'accélérer toutes les initiatives que nous connaissons essentielles. Et pour faire une petite rétrospective par rapport à l'état aujourd'hui de la RDC par rapport au paiement, nous avons fait tout de même un grand chemin pour rattraper les retards des pays comme le Kenya. Nous regardons l'Inde comme une cible. C'est que, comme je vous ai parlé de l'année 90, où, par exemple, moi, j'ai dû quitter mon pays, c'est que nous avons eu, de 90 à 2018, un long passage dans lequel ce n'était pas malheureusement parmi les priorités du pays. Nous étions une fois de plus en guerre et nous n'avions pas les possibilités de pouvoir développer toutes ces approches que d'autres pays ont développées. Mais nous sommes en train de marcher à grands pas vers ces intégrations. Aujourd'hui, il existe d'ailleurs, ça fait partie d'un des secteurs les plus vifs de la RDC. Nous avons beaucoup de fintech qui développent des solutions pour faciliter les paiements. C'est quelque chose qui est en train de venir et nous pensons que cette intégration de toutes les plateformes sera de nature à accélérer ce paiement, réduire les coûts dans un premier temps. Et ensuite, nous allons comme ça nous étendre sur les paiements transfrontaliers qui, nous savons, est une nécessité vers laquelle nous devons aller pour une Afrique connectée, forte et unie.
Thank you very much, Monsieur Jean-Luc, Eric, and Raj. I'm advised that we have a panelist who was supposed to be with us. I'd like to invite Madame Marie-France Chiapakati. I hope I pronounced it well. Please join us on the panel. She is the advisor on gender, social inclusion, and empowerment within the ministry, the delegated ministry on persons with disabilities and other disabilities. Right here? Thank you. So we will continue our discussion as she takes her breath. Raj, in your experience, especially now you talk of fintech and healthcare, how have these social enterprises contributed to what we call intra-regional trade and international trade? Okay, fintech is already clear, you are able to pay across borders. Let's talk about healthcare maybe. The innovations in this space and the social enterprises in healthcare. I know people are paying bills from Africa to go out there. So let's share a little bit about that. How does that promote the interaction within the region, in Asia and across?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. In terms of the healthcare, one of the examples that I can give, we have a very famous doctor in India called Dr. Devi Shetty. He's a cardiac surgeon, and he can do a heart surgery at a price that nobody in the world can do it. How does he achieve? One of his surgeries, an open heart surgery or even a major heart surgery, can be done for as little as $100. Now, people might think, how is that possible? What he has been able to do, because of the volumes and economies of scale that he's been able to do at his hospital based in a city called Bengaluru in the south of India, the hospital sees 4,000 outpatient in a day. So that's people who just walk in, no treatment, no surgeries, just come in, 4,000. And in terms of the surgeries, what Dr. Devi Shetty is gone to the manufacturers, the original equipment manufacturers, and worked out prices because of the number of surgeries that the hospital and his healthcare group do. He's been able to bring down prices that nobody else can match. What's the analogy for Africa? It's the demographic dividends that we get. Many years ago, India was cursed for saying you've got too many people on the planet and it's going to be a very major challenge for government. That was in the 60s and 70s, even 80s. Now, about 1.5 billion people, that's giving the demographic dividends, where today the Indian diaspora, people who've trained, studied in India, got opportunities outside the country, they remit $100 billion per annum. That's money that the government does not need to spend anything on. This is literally free money for every country that brings in, diaspora money. Yes, they would have spent on giving education, but most of the quality education in India, even today, is private. We are really improving in terms of the primary education system. So, answering the question with healthcare, this is how, if we can get, let's say, a healthcare group, if tomorrow I were to approach Dr. Devi Shetty and say that, can you provide some of the examples what you've been able to do in India, can you come and do and help us over here? His first question will be, how many people? What population are we doing it for? Once, even in Africa, if he were to come, he wouldn't look at country in isolation. He would probably look, maybe we start with a region like the East African region, and that's where he would be able to get those same costs that he is able to derive in India for Africa. So the same you would go to, I don't want to take the names of the manufacturers, the global names. If somebody in Africa, even a healthcare group from Africa were to go, they probably won't be able to match the numbers that Dr. Devi Shetty would be able to get. So he would procure those equipment in India for Africa. Yeah.
Thank you, Raj. I want to hang on to the healthcare question here. Good people, most of us here are from Africa, and we have this persistent malaria challenge. And we usually depend on conventional treatment for malaria. But we know that we have treatment for malaria originating from Madagascar and in the DRC right here. So my question to Eric, how can we proliferate these African solutions to healthcare, for example, and have them spread as consistently as possible across the region?
Thank you. Thank you. I think we find ourselves with unique challenges that need unique solutions. Based on what you've said about the medical aspect, I consider we need to scale down the production to a level in which can be accepted across board. I'm saying this in terms of production capacity and in terms of standards. I'm being told, and I'm not sure, I've never been to India, but Raj may try and explain this. In India, the reason why we have that is quite affordable is also because the production process has been harnessed to common facilities. I'm not sure. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I'm being told they can produce, several producers, small-scale producers can come within a facility, they produce their drug there, then they get to a government facility that can do packaging for them. I'm not sure whether that's true, but or whether my explanation is wrong. I'm not very sure. But probably you can learn from how they've been able to enhance the production and address the cost factor. Because within Africa, the cost of medicine is very high. But when it comes from outside, then the pricing is quite low. So if we are able to address the cost factors, address the issues of quality and access standards, then we as an African countries, then we can be able to have more of trade on these medicine products. So I foresee, or I see that we can work on our production strategy within African context, where those who have comparative advantage, ability to produce quality medicine, address the cost factors, can take that line and produce more. And then we'll be able to trade more on that. I believe on the issue of India, Mr. Raj probably has an experience that he can share and probably explain to us how the costs match. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador Kevin. Yes, coincidentally, my first job that I got was in the pharmaceutical industry in India. How is India able to produce? We are known as now the pharmacy capital of the world. I'd like to share something. Prior to COVID, the Indian pharmaceutical industry, the raw material for the medicines, what we call the APIs, was 70%, 70 to 80% was being imported from China. So China was very happy to supply the raw material. Indian pharmaceutical industry, we did not build those capacities. And when COVID hit us, that's why there was a major issue on certain medicines not being available when they were required. So what, again, I'm just trying to bring the government here as well. Immediately, government of India came and provided incentives for pharmaceutical industry to start getting into the APIs in India. Immediately, big incentives were given in terms of tax benefits, direct financial subsidies and all were given, where in the last 3 years, we've been able to bring that number from 70 to 80. I stand to be corrected, but we are now probably sitting at about 40%, 40 to 50%. And those are big numbers. The other question why India is able to produce, when the same Indian pharmaceutical company comes to Africa, why they're not able to produce at the same price that they're able to do it in India, is because of the ecosystem that we have in India. So it's not like you gave an example that a lot of 10 producers should go and have some shared common facilities. So if one were to import the machinery or expensive, again, we import from all over the world now. In the last 15, 20 years, India has been able to replicate the quality that we would get of machinery, pharmaceutical machinery, from Europe. And that's something that I also do with our clients, because we've had countries in Africa that are willing to, because of probably a mindset or over years, they would prefer importing the medicines from Europe than from India direct. And what was happening is the Indian exporter was sending it to one of their companies in Europe and then channeling it. So something that was probably $1 was coming and landing up in Africa for $5. So luckily I started, discussing this with several countries in Africa, and they understood now those countries are importing directly from India. Yeah.
Thank you, Raj. Now we go to Monsieur Jean-Luc on the same issue of how social enterprises can contribute to inter-regional, international trade and interaction and integration.
Alors, pour répondre à votre question, nous croyons à la plateformisation des économies au niveau de l'Agence pour le développement du numérique. Nous pensons que les entreprises sociales, du lieu où elles produisent, il faut qu'elles puissent avoir accès au marché le plus large possible. Et donc, il nous appartient de commencer à mettre en place des plateformes qui peuvent couvrir tout le marché africain, de sorte que tout ce qui est produit peut être rapidement acheté, peu importe où on se trouve en Afrique. Là, ça permettra à toutes ces entreprises sociales qui ont toutes chacune, en général, des particularités, des choses qu'elles font spécifiquement, elles, qu'on ne trouve pas ailleurs, même dans ces produits de masse. Nous pensons que c'est par là qu'on pourrait promouvoir ce marché des entreprises sociales. Il y a aussi l'aspect du local content. Malheureusement, c'est en train de se développer, mais pendant très longtemps, nous avons toujours préféré les produits qui venaient de l'extérieur. Nous les croyons plus sûrs, mieux conçus. Alors qu'aujourd'hui, nous faisons ici, nous l'avons vu dans le petit tour que nous avons pu faire, des produits d'une qualité identique, voire meilleure que ce qui se fait en dehors de l'Afrique. Et il nous appartient de pouvoir promouvoir ce savoir-faire africain et de pouvoir sensibiliser tous les Africains, et même au dehors de l'Afrique, de la qualité de ces produits qui ont été faits. Il y a des aspects réglementaires qui doivent être bien entendu renforcés, et dans ce cas-là, le gouvernement va faire sa part. Il y a aussi le privé qui doit lui aussi pouvoir être en mesure de rassurer, d'offrir des certaines assurances, des contrôles, pour que les gens sachent que le produit qu'ils ont sur leur assiette ou bien qu'ils mettent sur leur peau est un produit qui a quand même respecté les meilleurs standards. Nous pensons que c'est par cette voie-là que nous pourrons vraiment faire la promotion de cet entrepreneuriat social qui va de la base, mais il faut rapidement pouvoir lui donner les moyens de pouvoir atteindre des marchés aussi grands que possible.
Thank you. We now change gears a little and focus on the question of youth and women involvement in social entrepreneurship. Madam Marie-France, you are the expert on inclusion. You are the expert on empowerment of vulnerable persons. How are women and youth participating in this space of social entrepreneurship? How are they contributing?
Distingués invités, en votre titre et qualité, je suis heureuse de prendre part à cette activité que je représente son Excellence Madame la ministre déléguée en charge des personnes avec handicap et autres personnes vulnérables. Peut-être c'est la raison pour laquelle je n'ai pas été remarquée, mais Dieu merci. Je remercie les organisateurs aussi parce que c'est une occasion pour nous de faire encore une fois de plus les plaidoyers sur les questions de personnes vivant avec handicap. Et aujourd'hui, en particulier, on nous a demandé de mettre l'accent sur les jeunes et les femmes. Nous allons nous focaliser plus sur leur participation, telle qu'il m'a été posée la question. La participation des jeunes et femmes à l'entrepreneuriat social. Je me reprécisais qu'il existe une faible participation des jeunes et des femmes vivant avec handicap à tout de projets, voire même le renforcement des capacités sur l'entrepreneuriat social. Nul d'entre nous ici n'ignore que nous assistons à l'errance et la mendicité partout dans nos rues ici, précisément à Kinshasa. Tout ça, c'est d'abord à cause de l'ignorance et la faible information. Beaucoup de femmes et des jeunes vivant avec handicap ne sont pas informés sur ce qu'est l'entrepreneuriat, le bienfait, comment est-ce que ça peut le rendre autonome. Il y a aussi la question de la non-accessibilité aux innovations ou aux nouvelles technologies de l'information et des communications. Donc, vu que cette accessibilité ne tient pas compte, c'est-à-dire on n'a pas pris des mesures appropriées à chaque type de handicap, c'est difficile pour les femmes et les jeunes vivant avec handicap d'accéder aux nouvelles technologies. Par exemple, moi je suis une personne atteinte d'albinisme. Comme vous savez, la loi organique me reconnaît également parmi les personnes vivant avec handicap dans la catégorie des autres vulnérables. Là, loin, sans verre, je ne peux pas vous voir. Alors, comment est-ce que vous pouvez me mettre dans une salle de formation alors que je ne verrai pas ce que vous êtes en train de présenter? C'est-à-dire que on n'a pas tenu compte de ce qu'on appelle les aménagements raisonnables, selon la Convention relative aux droits de personnes handicapées, pour tout type de handicap, ce qui fait qu'on ne peut pas accéder au numérique, on ne peut pas être suffisamment informé sur cet entrepreneuriat social. Merci.
Okay. So the case has been made in the sense that the youth and women are not fully included, in the sense that persons with disabilities and vulnerable persons are not fully included as they should. So the only question we are remaining with Raj, Eric, and Jean-Luc is how can the state improve the participation of youth, women, and vulnerable persons in social entrepreneurship? That's the only question we are remaining with on our repertoire. We'll start with Raj.
Thank you, Richard. One of the things that the government could do in terms of encouragement, typically what the governments would be doing is providing incentives for, again, I keep going back to foreign investors, even within the country, to maybe private sector enterprise. Certain incentives are given for, as we see, maybe in terms of the employment opportunities. We have, many countries have implemented such practices. We see it in the Middle East. We see it even in India. We have it. I see it in a lot of countries in Africa, where you have to provide incentives. You can't have laws which will force people, because then some of them will just stay away from something that they don't accept. So I would look at it maybe like maybe a grading system. It could be when it comes to paying taxes for a certain enterprise. If you were to either employ or even to encourage entrepreneurship, you have people, a certain portion of your procurement must come from, businesses or products and services provided by people who are, owned, or the businesses owned by disabled people. So it's basically an incentive system, not a carrot and stick, but more of providing, and people will come in, if the right laws are implemented, people would start, and we would see the, evolvement in society when that starts.
Eric?
Thank you. I think the most important thing that governments can do is to create awareness to our people that, look, you as a community, you can advance an economic activity that you have been doing over time to realize income. Just create that platform to raise awareness. Because we look at what's being produced several places, we find that less is being consumed by even those who are producing. The potential is not being shared out about this market opportunity for social enterprise products. If governments can go out, reach out to the public, show them how to maneuver, how to develop these products, then it will be a plus. Secondly, another important thing is just to make sure that women and youth can access common facilities for production. Common facilities. Because, again, majority may really not know that some of these ventures, you don't need to establish it by yourself. But these common facilities can be hubs of incubation, incubating ideas, can be hubs of supporting the processing, can be hubs of market linkage and networking. I think, from where I sit, and I believe strongly that we need to reach out to women and youth just to see these opportunities and support them with the necessary infrastructure, and there we'll be able to go. Thank you.
Oui. Au niveau de l'État, premièrement, bien entendu, l'État doit encourager par des incitations pour l'emploi et la mise en place de mesures spécifiques pour les personnes vivant avec handicap. On remarque qu'elles ont des projets, elles sont porteurs de projets, et à ce niveau-là, l'État et le privé doivent aussi prendre des initiatives pour financer et appuyer, tant au niveau de la production et aussi au niveau de la commercialisation de ces produits. Ça, c'est une nation qui doit se prendre en charge pour pouvoir laisser personne sur le côté. Ensuite, pour le numérique spécifiquement, nous sensibilisons, et il existe des applications qui sont adaptées aux problématiques de vue, pour ceux qui voient mal, pour ceux qui ne voient pas. Et c'est des choses qu'il faut qu'on puisse pousser et réglementer pour s'assurer que les choses qui sont produites puissent être produites en tenant compte de tous ces périmètres. Donc l'État doit faire sa part et puis accompagné par le privé. Et l'entrepreneuriat social, une fois de plus, avec ses particularités, parce que c'est là qu'on est en mesure de prendre en compte les spécificités de chacun, et particulièrement placé pour apporter des solutions à ces problématiques-là à travers des projets qui montent et menés par ces personnes-là. Merci.
Thank you very much. You see, with regard to most vulnerable people, for instance, it makes a lot of sense if the newest app aiding blind people is developed by blind people. If the newest app aiding deaf people is developed by deaf people. And it becomes an enterprise for them, and government then supports that enterprise. However, Madam Marie-France, you framed the problem. Now it's an opportunity for you to share with us what solutions exist in time from the side of government at least. Go ahead.
Avant de répondre à cette question, j'aimerais aussi ajouter quelque chose pour ce qui a été fait pour accompagner ou soutenir l'entrepreneuriat social de personnes vivant avec handicap. Il y a déjà les textes qui existent, c'est-à-dire le gouvernement, à travers le ministère en charge des personnes vivant avec handicap, a travaillé au regard de politique, au regard de la législation ainsi que de programmes. Par rapport à la législation, il y a déjà la loi organique numéro 22/003 du 3 mai portant protection et promotion de la personne avec handicap. Cette loi met également l'accent sur l'entrepreneuriat. En son article 28, on signifie même que l'État a le devoir de promouvoir l'entrepreneuriat chez les personnes avec handicap ainsi que soutenir les activités à caractère rémunératrice. Donc vous comprenez déjà qu'il y a une loi qui existe et cette loi met également l'accent sur l'inclusion sociale à tous les niveaux, y compris dans le domaine de l'innovation. Il y a également la politique nationale de protection et de promotion de droits de personnes vivant avec handicap en RDC, ainsi que la stratégie nationale d'autonomisation et d'inclusion sociale de personnes vivant avec handicap. Ces deux documents ont été validés il y a déjà 2 semaines avec toutes les parties prenantes, les partenaires, y compris les ministères sectoriels, ceux du numérique également ont pris part, parce que le handicap est transversal. Ça touche tout le domaine, que ce soit la santé, que ce soit la culture et tout, raison pour laquelle on invite toujours tout le monde. Et ces 2 documents dont je parle, notamment la politique, relèvent d'abord les problèmes de personnes vivant avec handicap, y compris les solutions. Les solutions, on responsabilise et l'État et les personnes avec handicap elles-mêmes que nous sommes, ainsi que les partenaires et les particuliers. La stratégie nationale, telle que déjà la définition, c'est la stratégie d'autonomisation et d'inclusion sociale. Et dans l'autonomisation, on met également l'accent sur la mise en place des aménagements raisonnables pour chaque type d'handicap dans le cadre d'autonomisation. Et dans l'autonomisation, on vise plus l'entrepreneuriat. Et c'est-à-dire, si un entrepreneur veut venir auprès de personnes avec handicap, pour les autonomiser, il doit tenir compte du type d'handicap. Si c'est une personne sourde, alors vous voulez l'autonomiser, il faut mettre à sa disposition, je ne sais pas, leur tablette. Et pour les personnes aveugles particulièrement, il y a des tablettes en braille qui existent déjà. Et à travers le ministère des Personnes avec handicap ainsi que l'UNAV, l'Union pour les aveugles, on travaille également, on est en train de travailler sur la transcription de la loi organique en écriture braille. C'est pourquoi, pour faciliter l'accessibilité des personnes aveugles à la loi organique, à qu'est-ce qu'elle dit. Et il y a également les décrets, parce que la loi, elle est forte lorsqu'elle est renforcée avec des mesures d'application. Et parmi ces mesures d'application, il y a le décret fixant modalités de facilitation des fiscalités douanières, administratives également, c'est-à-dire à tous les organismes ou les organisations à caractère privé qui viennent ou qui veulent œuvrer pour accompagner les personnes avec handicap ou qui veulent se focaliser sur l'inclusion de personnes avec handicap au sein de leur entreprise et qui a tout le document en norme, a la facilité d'obtenir a la chance plutôt d'obtenir des facilités fiscales et douanières. C'est pourquoi c'est une manière pour nous d'encourager ces organismes-là à embaucher davantage les personnes avec handicap parce qu'ils savent que non, si je prends ce genre, je serai exonéré de certaines taxes administratives ou de certaines fiscalités douanières et tout. Donc c'est une manière aussi de travailler sur l'autonomisation et de répondre aussi à cette question de rente et mendicité. Et il y a également ces décrets-là portant création du Fonds national. Il est déjà créé un fonds Dieu et dont le chef de l'État pourrait nommer les animateurs, dont les directeurs généraux et autres. Et ce fonds-là sera pour accompagner les personnes avec handicap dans les cadres de projets d'autonomisation et d'accessibilité des personnes vivant avec handicap, y compris toute autre personne non vivant avec handicap, mais qui a la volonté d'œuvrer pour accompagner ces personnes. C'est comme je dis, au niveau de l'État, nous avons le rôle de vulgariser tous ces instruments juridiques. Parce que la majorité n'en savent pas quelque chose. Parce que si on sait ça, c'est très facile pour nous d'engager les personnes avec handicap, de les appuyer et nous-mêmes aussi de travailler pour ce genre. Et c'est un peu ça. Et l'autre solution que le gouvernement on peut aussi faire pour essayer de soutenir l'entrepreneuriat, c'est la mise en pratique des textes. Les textes, il y en a beaucoup, tels que je viens d'énumérer, mais la mise en pratique est très importante. Parce que dans ces décrets, il y a aussi les décrets qui parlent sur la représentation de personnes avec handicap dans les institutions. Mais quand nous allons sur le terrain, c'est chaotique. Alors, raison pour laquelle nous, déjà, on a la responsabilité de vulgariser les instruments juridiques ainsi que d'autres documents pragmatiques qui accompagnent ou qui soutiennent l'inclusion sociale de personnes vivant avec handicap, et aussi de travailler sur le strict respect et tenir aussi compte de l'accessibilité à tous les niveaux selon chaque type de handicap. Et si je veux parler sur ma petite expérience en tant qu'une personne atteinte d'albinisme, ça n'a pas été facile. Dieu merci, j'ai grandi dans une famille où on m'a quand même considéré une famille de 4 enfants, 2 atteints d'albinisme, 2 non atteints d'albinisme et tout. Mais en grandissant à l'école, ça n'a pas été facile. J'ai changé les écoles 3 fois parce qu'on criait sur moi, albinos, ça me faisait mal. Mais aujourd'hui, je peux en parler. Je trouve que c'est un moyen pour moi de sensibiliser. Et donc, ce que je veux juste dire que une personne vivant avec handicap, que ce soit albinos ou d'autres catégories, a besoin d'abord de l'amour, de l'accompagnement, de la vraie inclusion dans sa propre famille. Parce que tout commence là-bas. Si déjà dans la famille, il y a un problème d'inclusion, de considération, ça découragera déjà la personne avec handicap d'accélérer, d'atteindre ses objectifs ou exercer également ses potentiels.
Thank you very much. Thank you. As I told you, the personal story usually speaks. When she began her story, even the people who were dozing or nodding in approval woke up and they looked at us. So thank you very much, Madame Marie-France, for that. Ordinarily, this would be the time I would be inviting questions, but time is not allowing us to do so. Our panelists are with us all through today and tomorrow. If there is any issue or question you'd like to raise with them, please go ahead and engage them. We are also present on social media. Our colleagues in the digital side of the summit will display the social media handles so that you are able to increase the discussion in that way. We also have an app. We are going to ask the registry to share with you that app so you can broadcast it to whoever is not here. Let this summit not be limited to the 200 or so of us who are here. Let's make sure other people can participate too. I would like to thank our panelists, Madame Marie-France, Raj, Monsieur Eric, and Monsieur Jean-Luc. It's been an honor hosting you for this panel. That was to reflect on the state as a catalyst for social entrepreneurship that will then give us a people-driven development on the continent. I'll now hand over to the MC, but in the meanwhile, the panelists, we will stand in front here for a group photo, and then the MC will give us the next steps. Thank you very much.